The title poem for Falling Water, I began writing in 1991. I worked on it for a year, and it was the longest poem I've ever written. It's almost 500 lines long. It was autobiographical. It also had a kind of arts and crafts, Frank Lloyd Wright architecture subtext, because I had just moved into a place and had become interested in that. The other poems in the book, many of them go back a little longer. There's some as early as the mid-'80s. It took me a while to find a publisher after my former publisher, Princeton, stopped publishing poetry. And so it kept accumulating and getting bigger until I finally broke the poems into two book manuscripts, Falling Water first and then a book called The Constructor. Well, I usually have an idea of what I think of as the architecture of the poem, namely, roughly how long, what kind of lines, what kinds of cadences, what kinds of rhythms. And I usually have some vague idea of the content, but not anything specific. But I just follow this day-by-day procedure of getting some ideas in the shower and while I shave, and then writing anywhere from 2 to 10 lines, and then polishing them later before dinner, and just keeping at it until I feel the poem is finished. And I don't really worry too much about being prolific. Before I retired from philosophy, I would spend half the year working on philosophy and half the year working on poetry, and I would just sort of, it would usually come slowly but steadily. After I finished compiling a book of new and selected poems that will come out next year, I've really only written, I think, 3 poems since last July, but it doesn't bother me once this book comes out. If I'm certainly not going to stop writing, but if I don't compile enough for another book at my age, it doesn't really bother me. I'll just see what happens. I've written some essays in which I kind of reflect on what connections there might be between poetry and philosophy, but I really have kept them separate in my experience, and just in terms of when I would work on them. I actually don't even like poetry that's overtly philosophical. I did in the last couple of years, just to see how it would feel, write a few poems. They were actually prose poems or prose pieces that were explicitly and deliberately about philosophy, but I don't really see a tight connection between them. I think in poetry in terms of sentences, and so the writers who have influenced me the most are writers I think of it as great sentences, and that would include among poets chiefly T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, Elizabeth Bishop, John Ashbery, Mark Strand, and a number of others, and among prose writers, Proust and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Thomas Pynchon. All of them are just master sentence writers, and that's what I'm really interested in, sentences more than... I think sentences are the vehicle of thought, and I'm kind of interested in conveying the feeling of thought, so that's why I tend to think stylistically in terms of sentences. And I think of it as, well, I kind of agree with Harold Bloom's idea of poetry as kind of a form of internal soliloquy or talking to yourself, and you can talk to yourself about just about anything.